The $3.2 million villa purchase notification hit my son's phone at exactly 10:47 a.m. By noon, my phone was buzzing like an angry hornet. By evening, I was the most popular woman in Connecticut, and it only took destroying my family's financial expectations to make it happen. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me paint you the picture. 3 days ago was March 15th, my 64th birthday, the same day it's been for 64 years running. But according to my son, Brian, and his darling wife, Sarah, it somehow managed to sneak up on them again this year. What a coincidence that it happened to fall right during their annual spring getaway with Brian's mother-in-law, Patricia Wells, whose birthday conveniently lands on March 12th. Now, I'm not foolish. I figured out this little dance about 5 years ago. But this year, instead of my usual routine of subtle hints and not-so-subtle guilt trips, I decided to try something different. I said absolutely nothing, didn't mention my birthday once, didn't send those pathetic little reminder texts about having the weekend free, just smiled and waved when they packed their bags for their spa weekend in Vermont. The moment their car disappeared down my driveway, I called my real estate agent. "Jennifer," I said, "find me the most beautiful waterfront property you can locate, within 50 miles. Money is no object." She thought I was joking. 4 hours later, when we stood in the marble foyer of a stunning contemporary villa overlooking Long Island Sound, she realized I wasn't. The place had everything: floor-to-ceiling windows, a gourmet kitchen that probably cost more than most people's cars, a master suite with a fireplace, and a deck that made you feel like you were floating above the water. "It's $3.2 million, Mrs. Thompson," Jennifer said carefully, like she was delivering bad news. "I'll take it. Don't you want to think about it? Maybe discuss it with your family?" I almost laughed at that. When was the last time my family discussed anything with me? "Jennifer, I'm 64 years old and I've been thinking for most of them. Wire the funds tomorrow." That was Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, the deed was in my name. By Thursday morning, I was posting photos on every social media platform I could remember the passwords to. The living room with its sweeping ocean views. The kitchen island where I'd arranged a small celebration for one. The deck where I'd enjoyed my first solo birthday dinner in decades, complete with champagne and takeout from the most expensive restaurant in the area. The caption was simple: "Birthday celebrations at my new home. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones you give yourself." And that's when my phone started ringing. Brian was first, of course. My caller ID showed his name at 10:52 a.m., just 5 minutes after the bank alert would have hit his phone. See, Brian had been watching my finances for years, ever since Dad passed. Not officially, you understand. But he'd made himself a joint account holder for emergencies and set up alerts for any significant transactions. It was his way of keeping tabs on Mom, making sure I wasn't making any foolish decisions with my money. How thoughtful of him. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came from Sarah at 11:15. Then Patricia Wells herself at 11:43. Then Brian again at 12:02, 12:18, and 12:35. By 2 p.m. I had 17 missed calls and text messages ranging from concern to confusion to barely controlled panic. My personal favorite came from Sarah. "Mrs. Thompson, we're worried about you. This isn't like you. Please call us back so we know you're okay. Isn't like me. Lady, you have no idea what I'm like. You've just been dealing with the version of me that bends over backward to accommodate everyone else's convenience. Today, you're meeting Margaret Thompson, property owner and woman of independent means." I spent the afternoon unpacking the few boxes I'd brought from my old house. Personal items, mostly photo albums, my grandmother's china, the quilt my mother made for my wedding. As I arranged my new life around me, I couldn't help but smile every time the phone rang. 23 missed calls by dinner time. The messages were getting increasingly desperate, but here's what they didn't know yet, what none of them had bothered to ask about in the 5 years since Dad died. Aunt Helen's inheritance. Sweet, unmarried Aunt Helen, who lived quietly in her Boston brownstone and collected vintage jewelry. The same Aunt Helen that Brian and Sarah had met exactly twice in all their years of marriage and couldn't be bothered to attend her funeral. Last September, Aunt Helen, who left her entire estate to her dear niece Margaret, the only family member who ever took the time to visit, $7.3 million, to be exact. After taxes and fees, I walked away with enough money to do exactly what I wanted for the first time in my adult life, and what I wanted was to stop being invisible in my own family. I poured myself a glass of wine from my new wine fridge and sat on my new deck, watching the sun set over water that actually belonged to me now. The phone was still buzzing, but I'd turned off the sound. Tomorrow would bring conversations, explanations, and probably some very uncomfortable family dynamics. Tonight was mine. For 6 years, my birthday had been treated like a scheduling inconvenience. Not officially, you understand. There was always an excuse, always something that just happened to come up. And wasn't it just terrible timing that it had to conflict with my special day? Year one was understandable. Patricia Wells had fallen and broken her hip just 3 days before my birthday. Brian and Sarah needed to rush to Vermont to help her get settled at home. Family emergency be avoided. We'd celebrate when they got back, except we never did. By the time they returned, it was Easter preparations, then spring cleaning, then suddenly summer, and my birthday had simply been absorbed into the past. Year 2. Patricia had a cardiac episode that turned out to be anxiety and too much caffeine, but you don't know that when you get the panicked phone call, do you? Off they went to Vermont, leaving me with a grocery store cake and a promise to make it up to me soon. Years 3 and 4 followed the same pattern. Different emergencies, same timing, same result. Me, sitting alone on March 15th, pretending it didn't hurt that my only child had once again chosen his mother-in-law's manufactured crisis over his own mother's birthday. But it was year 5 that opened my eyes to the truth. I'd driven to the grocery store that afternoon, feeling sorry for myself and planning another solo celebration, when I saw them. Brian, Sarah, and Patricia Wells laughing over lunch at the new bistro downtown. This was the day after my birthday, mind you. The same day I'd received a hasty text about Patricia being too unwell for visitors after her latest health scare. She looked remarkably healthy for someone who'd supposedly been bedridden with vertigo, healthy enough to be raising a champagne toast. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 20 minutes, watching my son celebrate someone else's mother, while his own had spent the previous day wondering if she'd done something wrong. Something to deserve being forgotten, year after year. That's when I understood this wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was a choice. Patricia Wells had decided that the second week of March belonged to her, and my son had decided that keeping his wife happy was more important than keeping his mother from feeling like a stranger in her own family. So, this year, when March rolled around and I started seeing the familiar signs, the carefully casual mentions of Patricia not feeling well, and maybe they should plan something for later in the month, I made a choice. I chose silence. Instead of my usual campaign of gentle reminders and hopeful suggestions, I said nothing. When Sarah mentioned they were thinking of visiting Patricia that weekend, I just smiled and said, "How nice for you." When Brian called to check if I had anything important planned for the 15th, I told him I was keeping my schedule flexible. They left Friday afternoon with guilty expressions and promises to call. I waved goodbye from my porch and immediately called Jennifer, my real estate agent. Now, sitting in my new villa with my feet up on furniture that had never seen the inside of a family gathering I wasn't invited to, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. It trained me so well to be invisible that they'd forgotten to pay attention when I actually disappeared. My phone lit up with another call. Brian, for the 4th time this hour. This time, I answered. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady and pleasant. "Mom, thank goodness. Where are you? What's going on?" Jennifer from Coastal Realty called and said you bought a house. A $3.2 million house. I did indeed. I said, "It's lovely, Brian. Waterfront property, just like I always wanted." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Mom, are you feeling all right? This is very unlike you, unlike me." There was that phrase again, as if I was some predictable little mouse who couldn't possibly make a decision without committee approval. "I'm feeling wonderful, actually, the best I've felt in years. How's Patricia's birthday celebration going?" Another pause. It's fine. But Mom, we need to talk about this house purchase. This is a major financial decision. You should have consulted with us first." "Should I? Why?" Because you're not thinking clearly. You don't just buy a $3.2 million house on impulse." I walked to my new windows and looked out at the water. A sailboat was gliding past, its white sails catching the late afternoon sun. "Who says it was an impulse? Mom, you can't afford this. Dad's life insurance was comfortable, but not $3.2 million comfortable. What were you thinking? And there it was. The assumption that had driven so much of our relationship over the past few years. Brian had decided that I was financially fragile, emotionally fragile, probably mentally fragile, too. A woman who needed to be managed and protected from her own poor judgment. Brian, I said softly, there are quite a few things about my financial situation that you don't know. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not the helpless widow you've been treating me like. And this conversation is far from over. But right now, I have a new house to enjoy and a birthday to celebrate. Mom, wait. I hung up. The phone started ringing again immediately. I turned it off and poured myself another glass of wine. Tomorrow would bring more difficult conversations, but tonight was still mine. The inheritance that changed everything had been sitting in my bank account for 6 months before I even told Brian that Aunt Helen had died. I know how that sounds. What kind of person doesn't mention that a relative has passed away? But here's the thing about Aunt Helen. To my family, she barely existed. Brian had met her twice in his 38 years. Sarah had shaken her hand at our wedding and promptly forgotten her name. When I'd mentioned her in conversation, I'd get polite nods and vacant expressions. Helen was my father's sister. A woman who'd chosen career over marriage back when that was still considered scandalous. She'd worked her way up from secretary to vice president at a Boston insurance company, bought her brownstone in the 1980s when Back Bay was still affordable, and spent 40 years making quiet, intelligent investments. I was the only family member who visited her regularly. Every other month, I'd drive to Boston, and we'd spend the weekend together. We'd go to museums, try new restaurants, walk through the public garden. She'd tell me about her travels, her art collection, her complicated relationship with our father, who'd never quite forgiven her for refusing to settle down properly. Helen was sharp, funny, and completely unapologetic about living life on her own terms. Everything I'd been raised to think women shouldn't be. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last May, I was the one who sat with her through chemotherapy, appointments, the one who helped her organize her affairs when it became clear the treatments weren't working, the one who held her hand when she died on a quiet Tuesday morning in September. Brian and Sarah sent flowers to the funeral. They were at a wine-tasting weekend in Napa and couldn't possibly change their plans. After the service, Helen's lawyer, Marcus Reed, asked me to stay behind. Helen left very specific instructions about her estate, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. She wanted you to read this privately. Inside was a letter in Helen's precise handwriting. Dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Marcus's office, trying not to cry in front of a stranger. Stop it. I lived exactly the life I wanted to live, and I have no regrets. What you need to know is this: I've left you everything. The house, the investments, the art collection, all of it. Not because you're my only living relative, but because you're the only one who ever saw me as a person rather than an obligation or an embarrassment. I've been watching your family dynamics for years, and I need you to understand something. That son of yours loves you, but he's been programmed by that wife and her mother to see you as a burden to be managed rather than a woman to be respected. They've convinced him that you're fragile, that you need their protection, that you can't be trusted to make your own decisions. It's a subtle form of control, and I've seen it destroy too many women our age. They make you doubt your own judgment, then swoop in to help by taking over your life, bit by bit. Don't let them do it to you, Margaret. You're stronger and smarter than they've allowed you to be. Use this inheritance to remember who you were before you became someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's responsibility. Live boldly. Make them remember that you're not just Brian's aging mother. You're Margaret Thompson, and you deserve better than being an afterthought in your own family. The numbers Marcus showed me afterward were staggering. Helen's brownstone was worth $1.8 million. Her investment portfolio had grown to $4.2 million. The art collection she'd assembled over decades was appraised at $1.3 million, after taxes and estate fees. I was inheriting just over $7.3 million. I sat in Marcus's office for an hour, staring at the paperwork and thinking about Helen's letter. She was right about Brian and Sarah. Over the past few years, they'd positioned themselves as my caretakers, making decisions about what was best for Mom without ever asking what I actually wanted. When Dad died, Brian had immediately insisted on becoming a joint account holder for emergencies. He'd convinced me to switch to a simpler cell phone plan because the smartphone was too confusing for someone your age. He'd taken over handling my investments because financial planning is complicated and stressful. Gradually, I'd stopped making decisions and started accepting their suggestions. It was easier than arguing, and I told myself they meant well. But Helen's inheritance changed everything. For the first time in decades, I had the financial power to make choices without anyone's approval. The question was, what did I want to do with it? I kept the inheritance secret for months, watching my family's behavior with new eyes. The condescending smiles when I mentioned wanting to travel. The way Sarah would exchange glances with Brian whenever I expressed an opinion about anything more significant than dinner plans. The assumption that I'd always be available to babysit, attend their events, and revolve my schedule around their convenience. And then came this March, with the familiar pattern of my birthday being sacrificed to Patricia Wells's latest drama, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to stop being invisible. The villa purchase was just the beginning, a statement that Margaret Thompson was no longer accepting a supporting role in her own life. Brian's panicked phone calls and Sarah's worried texts were proof that the message had been received loud and clear, but they had no idea what else was coming. Helen's brownstone was still sitting in my portfolio, along with several investment properties I hadn't mentioned. The art collection was in storage, waiting for me to decide where to display it, and the remaining $4 million was earning interest while I planned the next phase of my newly independent life. My phone buzzed with yet another text from Brian. "Mom, we're coming home early. We need to talk about this house situation. Don't make any more major decisions until we get there." I smiled and typed back, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." But I didn't mention that I was meeting with a financial advisor tomorrow to discuss expanding my property portfolio, or that I'd made appointments with 3 different travel agents to plan the European tour I'd been dreaming about for years. Some surprises were worth waiting for. Brian arrived at my new villa at 7:30 a.m. Saturday morning, a full day and a half early from his Vermont getaway. He stood on my new front porch looking like a man who'd driven through the night, which, judging by his wrinkled clothes and bleary eyes, he probably had. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Good morning to you, too, sweetheart. Come in, I'll make coffee." He followed me through the marble foyer into the kitchen, his eyes darting around like he was cataloging evidence of my mental breakdown. I busied myself with the coffee maker, a gleaming stainless steel machine that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. "Mom, this is insane. You can't just buy a $3.2 million house without discussing it with anyone. What were you thinking?" I measured coffee grounds carefully, taking my time. I was thinking that I'm a grown woman with my own money who wanted to buy a house. "Would you like cream with your coffee? Don't be flippant, this is serious. Do you have any idea what kind of financial commitment you've made? The property taxes alone on this place will be astronomical, about $32,000 annually," I said, calmly. "Already budgeted for." Brian stared at me. "How could you possibly budget for that?" "Mom, Dad's life insurance was $400,000. Even with your savings and Social Security, you don't have this kind of money." And there it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. My dear son had been so busy managing my finances from his perspective that he'd never bothered to learn what my actual financial situation was. "Brian, when was the last time you actually looked at my bank statement?" "Actually looked, not just monitored for unusual activity." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I check for any large withdrawals or suspicious transactions to protect you from scams or poor decisions." To protect me. How thoughtful. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed him one. "What you've been doing is monitoring my spending without understanding my income." "What's that supposed to mean?" I sat down at the kitchen island, gesturing for him to join me. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Long Island Sound sparkled in the morning sun, perfect day for uncomfortable conversations. "It means that for the past 6 months, you've been treating me like a fixed-income senior citizen who needs to be protected from her own financial impulses. What you didn't know is that I inherited $7.3 million from Aunt Helen." Brian's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. "What? Aunt Helen passed away in September. She left me everything." "That's impossible." Aunt Helen was. She was nobody. She worked for an insurance company. She was vice president of that insurance company for 20 years. She also owned prime real estate in Boston and had a very impressive investment portfolio. But you wouldn't know that because you never bothered to get to know her. Brian set his mug down with shaking hands. $7 million. And you didn't tell me? Should I have? You've spent the last 5 years convincing me that I'm not capable of making my own financial decisions. Why would I consult with someone who thinks I need supervision to buy groceries? That's not. I never said that. You didn't have to say it, Brian. You've been treating me like an incompetent child since your father died. Joint bank accounts so you can monitor my spending. Simplified phone plans because technology is too confusing for someone my age. Investment management because financial planning is too stressful for me. His face was flushing now, the way it used to when he was caught in a lie as a teenager. I was trying to help. Sarah said that seniors often make poor financial decisions, that family should step in before I spent my own money on things I wanted instead of things you approved of, Mom. That's not fair. We've never tried to control your spending. I laughed, and it came out sharper than I intended. Brian, you monitoring my bank accounts and questioning every purchase over $500 is literally the definition of controlling my spending. We sat in silence for several minutes. Brian stared out at the water, processing this new information. I sipped my coffee and waited. After 38 years of being his mother, I knew when to push and when to let him work through things on his own. Finally, he spoke. Why didn't you tell me about Aunt Helen? Because I wanted to see how you'd react to me making an independent decision, and your reaction has been exactly what I expected. Panic, anger, and the assumption that I'm not capable of managing my own life. I'm not angry, he said, though his voice suggested otherwise. I'm concerned. This house, it's not you, Mom. It's too big, too expensive, too flashy. Too flashy for what? For a widowed senior citizen who should be grateful for whatever attention her family deigns to give her. That's not what I meant, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, Brian, what I was dreaming about or planning for my future? When did you last treat me like a person with my own desires instead of a responsibility to be managed? He was quiet for a long time. When he finally looked at me, there was something different in his expression, not anger anymore, but something that might have been recognition. I thought I was protecting you. From what? From living my own life. From making mistakes. From being taken advantage of. From the world changing too fast around you. I reached across the island and covered his hand with mine. Sweetheart, I raised you, managed your father's business affairs for 30 years, and navigated my way through becoming a widow. I think I can handle buying a house. Brian nodded slowly. Where's Sarah? Doesn't she want to see this place? I smiled, but it wasn't entirely kind. Sarah is back in Vermont with Patricia, extending their stay. Apparently, my house purchase is exactly the kind of erratic behavior that Patricia warned her about. She thinks I might be having some sort of breakdown. Are you? If finally standing up for myself constitutes a breakdown, then yes, I suppose I am. The question is, are you going to support me? Or are you going to keep treating me like a problem that needs solving? Brian looked around my new kitchen, taking in the expensive appliances, the marble countertops, the view that probably cost more per square foot than his entire house. This is really what you want. This is really what I want. He nodded slowly. Then, I guess we need to figure out how to make this work. It wasn't the ringing endorsement I'd hoped for, but it was a start, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Brian looked like my son, instead of a financial advisor delivering bad news. That afternoon, we sat on the deck talking about things we hadn't discussed in years, my dreams for retirement, his worries about his own future, the ways we'd both changed since his father died. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months, but I knew the real test was still coming. Sarah and Patricia would be back soon, and they weren't going to accept this new version of me nearly as easily as Brian was starting to. By Sunday evening, my phone had become a war zone of family drama. Word of my villa purchase had spread through our extended family like wildfire, and everyone had opinions about what it meant, what I should do about it, and most importantly, what was wrong with me. My sister Linda called first. Maggie, I heard about your house. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis? I'm 64, Linda. If I'm having a midlife crisis, I plan to live to be 128. This isn't funny. Brian is worried sick. Sarah is beside herself, and Patricia thinks you might need some kind of intervention. Patricia thinks. Of course she did. Patricia Wells had opinions about everything and everyone, and somehow her thoughts had become gospel truth to my daughter-in-law. What exactly does Patricia think? I need an intervention for buying real estate with my own money, for making major life decisions without consulting family, for isolating yourself from the people who care about you, for spending money recklessly when you should be planning for your future care needs. I almost laughed. Future care needs, as if I was one step away from assisted living instead of a healthy 64-year-old woman with excellent health care and enough money to hire live-in help if I ever needed it. Linda, let me ask you something. When you and Robert bought your Florida condo, did you ask anyone's permission? That's different. Robert and I discussed it together, and I discussed this with myself extensively. I'm not married, Linda. I don't need anyone's permission to spend my own money. The second call came from my nephew, Michael, Linda's oldest son. Aunt Maggie, Mom asked me to check on you. Are you feeling okay? I'm feeling fantastic, Michael. How are you? I'm confused, honestly. This house thing doesn't seem like something you'd do. There was that phrase, again, not something I'd do, as if everyone had decided exactly who Margaret Thompson was allowed to be, and any deviation from their expectations was evidence of mental instability. Michael, what do you think I'd do? What kind of person do you think I am? I think you're practical, conservative, someone who thinks things through carefully and doesn't make impulsive decisions. And you think buying this house was impulsive? Well, yeah, kind of. I looked out at my deck, where I'd spent the morning reading and drinking coffee while watching boats pass by on the Sound. I've been looking at waterfront properties for 2 years, Michael. I've been planning this purchase for months. The only thing that was impulsive was my timing. Why now, though? Why not wait until summer when you could look at more options? Because I got tired of being forgotten on my own birthday. Because I realized that if I waited for my family's approval to live my life, I'd die waiting. Because sometimes you have to do something dramatic to remind people that you exist. Because I found the perfect house and I could afford it. Sometimes life is that simple. The third call was the one I'd been dreading. Sarah calling from Vermont, with Patricia, undoubtedly, listening in the background. Mrs. Thompson, we need to talk. Hello, Sarah. How's the extended vacation going? It's not a vacation anymore. We stayed because we're concerned about you. Patricia thinks this house purchase might be a sign of cognitive decline. Patricia thinks again. And what do you think, Sarah? There was a pause. I think you're acting very unlike yourself. Maybe that's the point. What's that supposed to mean?